Okay, well, thanks, David. Sorry, you guys have like a similar name somehow.
Yeah.
It's pretty funny. But yeah, I'm ready to go. You guys ready?
Ready.
Yes, Sam.
All right.
Let me, is my sound quality okay?
It's okay. There might be a slight echo, but in general, it sounds pretty nice.
Okay, because I'm using a professional grade microphone, so hopefully
Okay,
that's
okay.
good.
Yeah. It sounds good. It sounds good.
Okay,
You usually you can tell afterwards more than during
yeah.
somehow, but yeah. Okay. Well, yeah, we're ready to go. Thank you, David. Thank you so much for being here.
Oh, hey, my pleasure. I look forward to chatting with you.
Absolutely. I just wanted to start off and really ask an introductory question of just what really led you to be interested in evolutionary psychology and sexual psychology.
Yeah, well, that's a big question. So I'll have to give a short answer. But when I first started getting into the field, there was no evolutionary psychology, and no one was studying human mating. But what I was interested in was theories of human nature. I wanted to find out what motivates people, what gets people out of bed in the morning, what makes people tick, why do people strive toward the goals that they strive toward. And I wanted a theory that basically a theory of human nature. And as I got more and more into psychology, I realized that all the existing theories lacked a solid scientific foundation. That is, why should we believe, I don't know, Freud versus Jung versus Rogers versus all these other theories of human nature, which were in the field of personality psychology, but they purported to be these grand theories of human nature. And so I went on a search for a solid scientific foundation for a theory of human nature. And that's what led me to evolutionary theory. And because you have to identify the causal origins of whatever human nature is, and that leads you to evolutionary processes of natural selection, and in particular, in the case of mating and sexuality, sexual selection, probably the most important theory out there. I mean, it's the theory of sexual selection provides the broad framework for understanding the mating systems of all species, including our own. So, I kind of got into this. I was interested in it starting as an undergraduate, but there wasn't really anyone I could work with. And so I got my graduate and a PhD in personality psychology. And then I got my first job at Harvard. And at Harvard, basically, they basically leave you alone. They said, like, here's your office, here are the keys, do whatever you want to do, and we'll check in with you in 4 years. So I was finally free to explore whatever I wanted to study. And so I started studying mating. And that's really what kind of launched my career in evolutionary psychology. And the more deeply I got into it, the more fascinating it became. I had to re-educate myself, because in psychology, you don't have to take any courses at all in evolutionary biology. So I had to learn everything from scratch. I learned everything on my own. And then, of course, through reading and through talking to evolutionary biologists. So I finally got to the point where I know a fair amount about evolutionary biology and evolutionary theory, which makes it a little frustrating to talk to my psychological colleagues, because almost none of them do. They, like me, received no training, took no courses in evolutionary theory. And so they have a kind of a newspaper understanding of it, a very superficial understanding, which usually is riddled with misconceptions. So anyway, that's a long-winded answer to your initial question.
So as somebody who sort of really pioneered, mating preferences in particular, why do you think it took so long for the field of psychology to make the jump from just sort of, more basic evolutionary theory, which you said a lot of people don't have an understanding of, to actually, tying in specific mating preferences to that broader theory? Why do you think that took so long to get there?
Well, I think that, part of it had to do with the fact, psychology is really very much an empirical discipline. And so at least in the United States and Canada, and I think most of Western Europe as well. And so basically they want to see the data, and so, until I did the 37 culture study of mate preferences, there really weren't good cross-cultural data. And if you're testing hypotheses about, in this case, universal sex differences in our mating psychology, you can't do it on a bunch of college sophomores in the United States. You have to do, and so that 37 culture study, that's really what that started, that empirical demonstration of sex differences that were universal is what caused psychologists to pay a lot of attention. And that was, and then, one thing led to another, and it wasn't just mate preferences, but tactics of mate attraction, tactics of mate retention, conflict within couples, which is what my new book is about, is sexual conflict, the ways in which men and women torture each other as they go through their mating lives. And so evolutionary theory provided and continues to provide deep insight and theoretically based predictions about what we expect to find. Being trained as an empirical scientist myself, had the data not supported the hypotheses, I probably would have abandoned it. You want to, there's no payoff to working with theory that does not pan out empirically. And it's not to say that all evolutionary hypotheses do. Some do not. But it was those early successes that I think caused people to take it seriously. And to Davis, to answer your one other facet of your question, which is a great question, is that the study of mating was virtually absent in all the social sciences. But from an evolutionary perspective, in sexually reproducing species, mating is absolutely central. Everything has to go through the process of mating. Failure at mating means you're an evolutionary dead end. And so another way of phrasing that is that all of us, all living humans, are evolutionary success stories. That is, that we come from a long and unbroken chain of ancestors, each of whom succeeded in selecting a mate, attracting a mate, keeping a mate long enough for reproduction to happen. And if any one of our ancestors had failed in that process, we would not be here. We wouldn't be here to even have this conversation about it. And so it's a pretty astonishing feat when you think about it, going back millions and millions and millions of years, that all of our ancestors succeeded and that we are the successful descendants of those successful ancestors. And so from an evolutionary perspective, you can run, but you can't hide from mating. And so mating theoretically is so central. People think of evolution as survival and survival of the fittest, but really mating is in some ways even more central than survival. Of course, you have to survive long enough to mate, but we have adaptations that exist that, especially in males, that decrease survival probability, but that exist because they lead to a mating advantage. So theoretically, mating is crucial. But prior to this work, there weren't any theories in psychology that said, mating is important. And I use the term mating in a broad sense. So not just sex or sexual intercourse, but all the things around it. So in sexually reproducing species, you have to compete with same-sex rivals for access to desirable members of the opposite sex. You have to attract them, you have to retain them, you have to continue to ward off rivals. And so it's a complicated process. And so that's why I think humans have a very rich psychology of mating. And we know a lot more than we did 30 years ago, but there's still a lot to be discovered.
Absolutely. And it's a nice optimistic note to say that, we are the success story that everyone has as really everyone alive right now has come from all these ancestors who have been successful at mating. So it's a good thing to be optimistic about. Um, but something I'm very interested in, and that's the convergence between evolution and culture. I wanted to ask if you know any culture that you've seen that is the most distant from our evolutionary nature, particularly, and is it being harmed by that opposing cultural context?
Yeah, well, that's an interesting question. And there's a lot of work now being done on cultural evolutionary psychology. But what I would say is the area that interests me the most, and I think that most directly gets at your question, is falls under what's called the mismatches. So, are there cultures where the living circumstances are fundamentally mismatched with the circumstances in which we evolved? And and the answer is that many or most cultures do have these mismatches, and although to varying degrees. So, for example, in the small group living context in which we evolved, we would have encountered perhaps a few dozen potential mates in our entire life. Whereas now we have internet dating, right? So, which exposes us to potentially thousands and thousands of potential mates on a scale that we never would have encountered ancestrally. And this results in some, in what's called decision paralysis, which is, that if you, like these experiments started with like the jams, where you give people a choice of 6 jams, and they sample each jam, and then they go, oh, I like this one, I'll pick this one, and they buy it. But if you give people 24 jams, they sample and they can't decide. It's just they get too overwhelmed by the choices. That's called decision paralysis. And I think the same thing is happening in mating to some extent. People get on online these dating services, and there are hundreds, thousands of people, and they always think, oh, there's someone just a bit better right around the corner, just a little bit closer to my ideal mate. And so that's one domain. Of course, in the domain of food, there are tremendous mismatches. I mean, we evolved as hunters and gatherers, and we don't do hunting and gathering anymore, or at least very few cultures do. In another discrepancy, and this is cultures differ on this, is that parents historically had a large influence over the mating decisions of their sons and daughters. And now, at least in many modern cultures, the individuals are making their own decisions. Some are influenced by their parents, but overall, I think the trend has been toward less parental influence over the mating decisions. And so that's another form of mismatch. Of course, there are some cultures, some subcultures within India and the Middle East, and where parents do have a large say. In the extreme case, arranged marriages. So anyway, these are a couple of examples of mismatches where, and I think that these mismatches are important to attend to, because some are good. So in principle, you have access to a wider variety of potential mates than you would have ancestrally. But on the other hand, the downside is that decision paralysis. So there are upsides and downsides to all these mismatches.
So these mismatches that you just described, would you say that they're sort of part of like a broader trend in the last, maybe since the sexual revolution, or at least the last several decades, where many Western cultures have sort of been moving this direction of liberalization? And would you say that it's sort of like an unprecedented change, or would you say that you can view it in the context of different cultures simply have different views on sex, or was it more of a linear progression towards liberalization recently?
Well, I think that there have been pendulum swings on that issue, and so the Roaring 20s, for example, was a time of sexual experimentation. and more liberalization, as you call it. The Victorian era before that, was more restrictive. And so I think it oscillates a bit, and but it doesn't oscillate randomly. So it's not like it all moves in one direction culturally. It's partly determined by a very predictable evolutionary factor, which is sex ratio, the ratio of males to females in the relevant mating pool. And when there's a surplus of women in the mating pool, the whole mating system tends to shift more toward casual sex, casual hookups, less committed mating, lower rates of marriage, more unstable marriages, higher divorce rate. When there's a surplus of men in the mating pool, it shifts in the opposite direction toward more long-term committed mating and less short-term mating. And so, one of the things that's happening right now, and this is, I guess, another mismatch, is in Western Europe and in Canada and the United States, so in North America, there's a surplus of women who are college educated. So, in almost all universities and colleges, except for the engineering schools, where you still have a surplus of men. And so what this means is kind of very interesting, in that these sex ratio imbalances interact with evolved mate preferences, in that educated women typically want educated, high status, good job men as mates, but there aren't enough of them to go around now. And so this is, I wrote an essay, and I talk about this in my new book as well, that there's a mating crisis among educated women. Now you'd think that that men might pay attention to this and say, wow, there are great mating opportunities if I get a college education or get a higher degree. But it doesn't seem that men are paying much attention to that, perhaps because sexual access is so much easier now in the modern environment with Tinder and casual hookups that are so much easier. Men don't have to work as hard as they used to get sexual access to women.
I read the article just recently that you were talking about. It was in 2016,
cool.
Correct? So
yeah.
It was super interesting, and it's interesting because I never really connected sort of just how simple it was, the gender ratio to all these sort of different behaviors you were describing and cultural changes. But I guess the question that I was going to ask you that I didn't see in the article is, because people of our generation are sort of in a phase of their life when they're seeking to find a mate, do you predict that there will be ramifications of this, throughout our lifetime? So higher rates of divorce in a few decades, or higher rates of marriage instability, more conflict in marriages, sort of going forward?
Yeah, well, predicting the future is always a hazardous venture. If you go back and look at people who predicted things, they often turn out to be wrong. I mean, like in an earlier era, and this was before your time, people were really worried about a population explosion, because the population on Earth was exploding, and that people worried there weren't enough resources, not enough food around. Now people are worried about just the opposite, that people are not having enough kids to replace the population that exists. And this is true in, I don't know if it's true in Spain, but it's true in,
very much so.
Yeah, so I know it's true in many Western cultures. So for Spain, Italy, even the Scandinavian cultures, they're reproducing it below replacement levels, and people are really worried about it. And so this is just an example of how the predictions of sort of population explosion and the disaster that would occur were all wrong. Now we're worried about the opposite problem. So who knows what's going to happen in the future? It is the case. I mean, this is one very important trend. There is a trend, again, in Western Europe and North America, where marriage rates have gone down. People are reproducing later in life, if they reproduce at all. So there are more people who decide they are foregoing reproduction, and they're having fewer kids. So I think I'm old enough to know that, like in my generation, I think the average was something like 3. And now the average in the United States is below 2. So it's below. The only reason the United States is able to do okay for the moment is because of immigration. Because people come in and sort of fill the gap um, in producing children. But the United States will probably also face this below replacement issue. And China is also facing it as well. Japan, North Korea, not North Korea, South Korea is facing it as well. So I don't know. One trend that's clear is that internet dating and mating will continue. So even in the last 5 years or so, it's dramatically increased. Where again, in an earlier era, there was a stigma attached to getting on these services because it was believed only losers who can't find a mate get on these things, and so there was a kind of shame and stigma attached to it. And now everybody does it. So that's something like 50% of people find their partner through these internet dating services now, and it's probably going to continue to increase.
Although we can't see the trends in the future for these what's going on right now with online dating, do you see any current correlation or causation with mental health, or with any type of, as you said, there was like these sexual issues of decision paralysis? Is there a deeper layer to that may affect our well-being?
Well, that's an interesting question. I mean, the two spheres of life that are important, which interestingly Freud did identify, love and work. If you don't have either one going well, then that's going to affect mental health. And so there has been an increase. I mean, I don't know if it's temporary or not, but during the pandemic, there's been an increase in mental health problems, a dramatic increase in anxiety and depression. And part of it is mating related, in that people during the pandemic weren't free, at least in many places, were not free to actually go out and meet people, and they weren't free to break up with a partner who was if they were in a bad relationship and they wanted to exit the relationship, they couldn't get out because they were in many cases in lockdown with and stuck in this bad relationship. And that has affected the mental health of individuals. I've seen it with my own students even. The rates are, I don't want to put a figure on it, but substantially higher for things like anxiety and depression. I don't know. The drive to mate is very powerful. So I don't think that's ever going to go away. How people, implement that desire, we'll see. I mean, here's another thing that's coming down the pike. Here's a prediction: is sex robots and virtual reality sex. So these new technology now we have pornography, but the sex dolls and the virtual sex these technologies are being rapidly developed, and it will be interesting to see what happens there, because some object to sex dolls and think that will lead to the further sexual objectification of women. But there's also some evidence that these sex dolls might have a beneficial effect in reducing rape rates. That is, there's some men who can't attract a woman through the normal means. There's the acronym is the incels. Have you guys heard about the incels? The rage of the incels. Incel is an acronym for involuntarily celibate. And there are these online, I guess, groups and that are very angry toward women in particular, because they desire women, but the women do not reciprocate that desire. And so, providing men who cannot attract women through the normal means, providing them with sex dolls might be a way to reduce rape rates or other forms of conflict that that emerge. So these technologies are going to come online, and it's even an interesting thought experiment with virtual sex. Like if you could, through virtual sex, have sex with the woman of your dreams. I don't know, it might be an actress like Scarlett Johansson or whoever, and it could mimic real life sex to such an amazing degree that it might even be better than an actual sexual encounter. Would you choose to do that and forego an actual sexual encounter? It's an interesting thought experiment. Will people get experience this virtual sex and then say, I'm sign me up, I'm foregoing all the hassles having to do with a relationship? I don't know.
Fair enough.
So as
we live in interesting times. Yeah,
as a evolutionary psychologist, obviously, and someone who studies mating preferences, I guess obviously the big difference is that something like that doesn't lead to reproduction. So is there a cause for concern with sort of that shift away from the humane part of sex? Any, like what Alvaro mentioned with mental health or replacement rates, basically, are sex robots a concern for society?
Yeah, possibly. I don't know. I mean, if the people who end up using the sex robots are people who can't attract mates to begin with, then it's probably not going to have much of an effect. If it starts to replace or interfere with actual reproduction, then that's going to further the real problem of replacement rates. Because you combine the sub replacement rates with an aging population where people are living a lot longer due to modern medicine than they used to, and so you have a shrinking worker population that's in essence supporting a growing aging population, and it could lead to disaster. I mean, that's why, like in China, they're trying to encourage people to have more kids now. In some countries, they're actually paying people to have kids. They're doing whatever they can to get, to promote reproduction in countries where the replacement rate is truly problematic.
Sarah Hardy said men are a long breeding experiment led by women. It was said in your book. If you have sex robots implemented in there, I feel like the women's perception of the experiment will be completely distorted. So how can this recent shift in society inflict the mating balance, and how can the future like sex robots, etc., also inflict this balance between men and women?
Yeah, what balance are you referring to?
Well, the balance that currently exists. I don't know. I'd say the evolutionary nature of sexual mating. So perhaps not the current one, but more the what was natural in the past.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the way that I think about it is we have this evolved set of psychological mechanisms, psychological adaptations, and we're stuck with them. You can override them. So for example, let's say we have evolved taste preferences for sugar, fat, salt, and protein. And so that's why, McDonald's and fast food places are so wildly successful, as they package these things in intense quantities where you can rapidly consume them. But you can, and this of course has led to all kinds of problems like obesity and type 2 diabetes, but you can override them. Let's say you have a goal of you want to get physically fit, you want to lose some weight. You can override your taste preferences and say, okay, I'm not going to eat these McDonald's hamburgers or whatever for this higher goal. But what you can't do is you can't change your taste preferences, or at least they're more difficult to change. You can't if someone puts sugar on your tongue, you will always experience that as sweet. And so I think that the same is true with our mating psychology. That is, we're stuck with the mating psychology we have, and we in the modern environment artificially activate our mating psychology in different ways and other psychology. So even when you go to the movies and you vicariously experience warfare and treachery and status hierarchy negotiation and mating and infidelity, and so these are all things we're fascinated by, and so they're triggering or activating our evolved psychology. But it's just a movie, or with pornography, these are just pixels on a screen that are activating our mating psychology and getting people physiologically aroused. But there's no mate there. It's just pixels on the screen. And so I guess my point is that in the here and now, all we have is our evolved psychology, and in the here and now, we're just activating it through some means that are historically natural and through some means that are artificial. Anyway, I don't know if that answers your question, but those are some random thoughts on it.
So it sounds as though a lot of sexual psychology is sort of at the subconscious level, and decisions to override it are at the conscious level. So in your research, discovering the subconscious part of that equation, what's the most surprising or counterintuitive thing you found about how humans select mates?
Well, I think there's there have been some really fascinating discoveries about the psychology of attraction, that what we're attracted to that were not known earlier, that are true scientific discoveries. So for example, waist to hip ratio is one. So prior to Devendra Singh, a former colleague of mine who unfortunately has passed away, he discovered waist to hip ratio, and it turns out waist to hip ratio is a powerful cue to fertility in women. And it's also a cue to younger age, also a health indicator. And that's something that occurs subconsciously, as people don't look at a woman and they just find the woman attractive. They don't necessarily know why. They don't think to themselves, this woman has a very low waist to hip ratio, therefore I find her attractive. No, these things are just registered unconsciously. Another example would be symmetrical features. So symmetry, so humans evolved as bilaterally symmetrical creatures. You draw a line down your body, and you're supposed to be symmetrical, but everybody has deviations from symmetry and deviations from perfect symmetry. That is people get lopsided, and some people are more lopsided than others. And so it turns out that this is another one of these very subtle cues where the asymmetries are caused by either environmental insults, so injuries or diseases during development, or they're caused by a high mutation load. So we all have genetic mutations, but some people have more mutations than others. And it's like throwing sand in a machine that can disrupt the development of the organism into a perfectly bilaterally symmetrical being. And so it turns out both men and women find symmetrical individuals to be attractive. So this is another kind of subtle cue. And this one was discovered not by me, but by people like Steve Gangestad, Randy Thornhill, Anders Moeller, and others who came from the non-human literature, because the symmetry was studied in sexual selection experiments with avian species, and they thought, well, what about humans? And so it's an interesting kind of a transport of an idea from the non-human literature into the human literature. So there are things like that. Here's a closer to my own research, and this is also something I talk about in the new book, which, by the way, people who listen to this, they might be interested in the new book. Let me just show you what it looks like in the American version. So the books look like this.
I have this one over
Uh,
here.
yeah, okay, that's one of my favorites
Just a
as
little
well.
promote.
Yeah. So this is When Men Behave Badly: The Hidden Roots of Sexual Deception, Harassment, and Assault, and it's all about conflict between the sexes. And one of the things I talk about in the book, and this is to answer your question, Davis, something that surprised us is backup mates. Okay, what we call mate insurance. So what we found, this is research that I did with Josh Duntley, who's a former graduate student of mine, now a professor in his own right. It's the first study that was ever done of backup mates. Do people have backup mates? So that you're in a relationship, you're in a happy relationship or an unhappy one, do you still cultivate backup mates? And the answer is yes. Most people do. They have at least one, sometimes two or three backup mates, even if they're in an unhappy relationship. And this is interesting because what we had reasoned was that in over evolutionary time, something could always go wrong. That is, your mate could become diseased and die. If it's a male, could get killed in a war with a neighboring group. Could get injured. Could get injured in a club fight or axe fight within the group. Could dump you. Could decide they're going to do mate switching. And so our hypothesis was that people who cultivated a backup mate would be left to transition should something go wrong in their primary relationship. They'd have like what we call mate insurance. That's analogous to car insurance or house insurance. You have a car insurance, house insurance. In the event that something bad happens to your car or your house, same with mates. But it surprised us how ubiquitous backup mates are, and it may be disturbing to, for example, men to realize that even if they're in a happy relationship, their partner might still be on the side cultivating, this, keeping someone kind of on the string. I don't know how you say it in Spanish, but you know what I'm talking about. Stringing someone along or keeping a potential backup mate. Does that make any sense at all?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, of course. Mate insurance. Yeah, yeah. Of course,
Yeah.
of course.
Okay.
Spanish, I don't know how I would describe it.
No.
Does understanding these things help to stabilize relationships? Like, intellectually that this is something that can happen on both ends, or is it just something that will continue to happen no matter what? As you said, like, someone might find it disturbing, but what do you do with the knowledge?
Yeah. Well, I don't know. I mean, my view is my general view is that it's always better to know than not to know. But some kinds of knowledge, I guess, can be dangerous. But I think as a general rule, it's better to know these things and to put them in the appropriate place. So here's another example that I use, and you were Alvaro kind enough to mention my book, The Evolution of Desire. And this is after reading The Evolution of Desire, I got an email from a guy who had read the book. And he said that reading this book helped him to remain more faithful, more sexually faithful to his wife. And what he realized is that when he was attracted to women who were not his wife, that was just the evolved desire for sexual variety. It didn't mean that he didn't love his wife. So he had previously been interpreting it, well, I'm attracted to other women, maybe it means I don't love my wife. But once he realized these are two separate evolved mechanisms. One is desire for sexual variety. The other is the emotion of love, which is for long-term pair bonding and commitment. And they're not incompatible. And so he said that just this knowledge of these evolved features of our sexual psychology help him to remain more faithful. So
that makes a lot of sense, because I was thinking, as men get older, they may prefer to mate with women who are younger, increasingly younger than the men are themselves. So giving given this nature of long-term relationships, this conflict, would you say um, is solvable because of this defense that is love?
Yeah, I think it's solvable. I mean, different people solve it in different ways. But just the knowledge that even if you're in a happy relationship, it will people still get attracted to other people, and it's important to interpret that correctly. Um, uh, Now, some people solve it with, like in the modern day, here's another trend is, I don't know how widespread it is polyamory. So people in relationships with multiple people simultaneously, and that's one solution. But that's probably a solution that's not going to be sit well with most people, because you have this other evolved feature of our psychology, namely sexual jealousy, which tends to interfere with the delight that you might experience with your partner getting sexual satisfaction from someone else. Most people, don't get delight. They talk about that in the polyamory community. This notion of compersion is what they call it, is when you experience this delight that your partner's getting sexually satisfied by someone else. But I think that most men and probably most women would not experience that delight. So I think it's a subset of people who may be unusually low in jealousy might opt for the polyamory solution. But I mean, we're a pair bonded species, and that's one major component. That's one major strategy in our menu of mating strategies, is pair bonding with one person over time. Not the only strategy, but it's an important one.
Yeah, I personally never met someone who's told me that they were in that community, but I'm sure it's still a pretty small subset. But there's all kinds of people in the world, I suppose. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I was
You're young. You're young. You will be encountering people in that community.
Yes, one day. I was wondering though, just sort of in the course of your research, obviously a lot of people have strong feelings about these topics, and it sort of, brushes up against cultural norms, religious norms, maybe some opposition to, universal sex differences. So what's some like substantial pushback you received on any of your theories, if any?
Yeah. Well, it hasn't. It hasn't been a lot. So I would say you hit on one that that upset people. So one is some people don't like there to be any evolved sex differences because they think that if there are, that will somehow doom us to discrimination against women or interfering with women getting equal jobs, equal access to everything. But I think it's a misguided worry, because these sex differences are not in abilities. They're sex differences in our sexual psychology, in our mate preferences, in our sexual desires. So some people get upset about the sex differences. Some people get upset about the specifics of the sex differences. So the fact that men place a greater priority than women do on a potential mate's physical appearance and relative youth, that upsets people. And you can probably predict who it upsets. It's not going to upset young, attractive women as much as it's going to upset older, unattractive women. And so some of the findings people don't like. And I think that I sometimes view evolutionary psychology as an equal opportunity offender, in the sense that across the political spectrum, it offends some people on the religious right who have worldviews that God created the earth and all its inhabitants in 6 days, or other sort of creationist belief. And so they don't like evolutionary theory for that reason. But then it upsets people on the left side of the political spectrum who I think erroneously think that if things are evolved, then you can't do anything about it. That acknowledging evolutionary psychology will interfere with social justice goals. And I think it's just the opposite. The more knowledge we have, the better we will be able to implement whatever social justice goals we have. So, and combined with the thing that I mentioned earlier in our discussion, which is that most people don't really have much education in evolutionary theory. And so most people are ignorant and have all kinds of misconceptions about what it is. And so I think the solution to that is better education. I mean, I think some people argue you should get this stuff in, as early as age 7 or 8. But I think at a minimum, high school students should get educated in fundamentals of evolutionary biology, so that when they hit college, they're not like, oh, this is new. I've never heard this stuff before. So I think that's the solution. But one other aspect, and this relates again to my new book on sexual conflict, which is that some people like to view human nature as fundamentally good, and that whenever there's any bad stuff, crime, violence, aggression, sexual harassment, or whatever, that the causes are all due to the corrupting influences of bad parents, a bad culture, a bad political system, or whatever. And so this sort of romantic view as humans as fundamentally good, but corrupted by bad people and bad cultures, I think is evolutionary psychology kind of refutes that view, because it says, what we have is adaptations to do good stuff, to cooperate, to be generous, to bestow benefits on others. But we also have adaptations to do some nasty stuff, some cost-inflicting stuff. So Steve Pinker calls the first group the better angels of our nature. And I call the second group the darker demons of our nature. And so human nature has all these things. We have the whole collection of things we would consider morally good and morally bad features, but we can deeper knowledge of these evolved mechanisms can help us to activate the good ones and keep the bad ones at bay, or keep the bad ones quiescent or unactivated. And so it's a more nuanced, complex view of human nature than most people have, because humans are neither perfectly good or perfectly bad. I mean, we have both darker demons and better angels in our nature.
Oh, yeah. I completely agree with that. And something else that I wanted to comment on when regarding sexual differences was that that is very controversial, is that personality traits such as ambition may be more attractive for women, and other traits that they say that for the economy, like for engineers, for example, there might be more men than women, etc. Do you think that does this influence the gender pay gap, and does it influence it in a just way?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. That's a topic that I haven't really explored much. So I don't know about I don't know whether these things influence the gender pay gap, but I guess I would mention a couple things that we do know. So one is that studies of time allocation and energy expenditure do show sex differences, such that women tend to allocate, they tend to distribute their time and energy across more domains than men do. So for example, women tend to invest more in their friendships, they invest more in their families, their genetic relatives. Even married women invest more in keeping good connections with their husband's genetic relatives. Men tend to be on average, these are on average differences, always a ton of exceptions and overlapping distributions, but men on average tend to be more monomaniacal in wanting to claw their way up the status hierarchy and obtain the resources that are attractive to women. So it's possible, and these aren't differences in ability. They're not differences in intelligence. They're differences in preferences, and women have always been key in, that's part of their reproductive strategy is to maintain close kin ties and also friends, what Sarah Hrdy calls, allo parents. So friendships that help raise the kids. And so some of those preferences, which I think are evolved preferences about time allocation and energy allocation, those could result in potential pay gaps. That's not to say that there isn't sex discrimination when it comes to pay gaps, because I think there is evidence that there is, at least in some fields. I know of a good female friend of mine, and this was a while back. I think it doesn't afflict academia as much as it used to in the past, but this friend of mine, she was a very high performer, and the chair of her department told her that she was getting a lower pay raise than someone who came in at the same time, a male, because the chair said she had a husband who had a good income, whereas this other guy, his family was solely dependent on his income. Well, that's sex discrimination when it comes to pay, and of course should not happen. I mean, in my opinion, that equal pay for equal work. So, but I think that's very rare, at least in academia. I don't know about other disciplines. But anyway, those are a couple random thoughts on your question about pay gaps.
Was she able to get that resolved?
Well, she is now she's now earning 5 times as much as any other male colleague I know. She's actually president of the university right now. I won't mention the university or her name, but she's actually a very famous president of a very good college on the East Coast in the United States. So she's done very well for herself.
That's great.
So whatever that was a very temporary setback in her career.
So one question I have is, it sounds like, even in the course of your career, there's been a lot of progress on these issues, a lot of discoveries that just a few decades ago we had no concept of. So for people who are just now getting into this, maybe the undergrads or they're just starting a program, what are the big questions that you're sort of looking forward to seeing further exploration on, or issues that need to be resolved within this discipline?
Well, that's a great question. I'll throw out a couple off the top of my head. I think one of them that is centrally concerned with the work that I do is, and really is a direct consequence of writing my book on sexual conflict, is applied evolutionary psychology. So that is, how can this knowledge be used to reduce or eliminate things like sexual harassment, intimate partner violence, sexual coercion, sexual assault, stalking, and all these nastier things that I talk about in the book. And I think that deeper knowledge of them can be applied. Now, I consider myself a basic researcher, and so I haven't devoted a ton of energy toward applying these things toward solving some of these problems, but I've become more and more interested in that. And I think that we now have enough knowledge that we can use this knowledge to beneficial effect. And so I think that's one big domain. I think there's still a lot we don't know about human mating psychology, by the way, as I mentioned before. So there's still gold to be had there. Another topic, though, that's, I think, really, really important, I'll mention two, one of which I'm studying and one of which I'm not, is status hierarchies. That is, we evolved in the context of small group living, and all groups have status hierarchies. Some people are up, some people are down. and your position, your relative rank changes over time. And so we have to have, and your position in status hierarchies influences your access to, among other things, better mates, but also a wide variety of other reproductively relevant resources. And so we must have a very rich psychology of status striving, of hierarchy negotiation, of dealing with rivals who threaten our status, to dealing with suffering a blow to our status such that we plummet in status. We must have a very rich psychology of status and hierarchy navigation. And so we're currently exploring that. Patrick Durkee, one of my current graduate students, and I we've published a couple papers on this topic, and we have a lot more studies that we're designing. So I think that's a very rich vein that has been relatively unexplored by anyone, and relatively unexplored by evolutionary psychologists. Another one that I'm not studying is coalitional psychology, which I think is very relevant to things like the current political polarization that you see in Western Europe and North America, where we have a very powerful coalitional psychology of my group versus other groups, in group, out group, enmity, coalitional psychology can be a good thing, but also can be a bad thing. But we know relatively little about our evolved coalitional psychology, and that's harder to study, but I think very, very important to study. And some of my colleagues out at UC Santa Barbara, John Tuvey, Lita Cosmides, and some of their students and former students have been starting to explore coalitional psychology in greater depth. So I think that's another important area for future research. And then I guess the last thing I'll mention in terms of important future topics is emotions. So I've studied the emotion of jealousy and sexual jealousy, a little bit on the emotion of envy, a little bit on pride and shame, a little bit on sexual disgust, but I think greater attention to understanding our evolved emotions, or evolved emotion programs and their functions. And that's a very rich vein. And a lot of evolutionary psychologists are starting to explore different facets of these emotions. So I think we're going to see some major developments in the next 5 years in that domain.
Wow.
Thank you for that answer.
Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating to see that there's so much science there still needs to be discovered. It's not that expected for some people. People think that everything's already discovered, but
oh no, long way away from it. Well, and that's what makes it exciting. I mean, that's why it's so exciting to be in this field, because there's I hate to be in a field where everything had already been discovered and all there is a little bit of cleanup work to do. So it makes it exciting for me.
No, and it's crazy that you are one of those protagonists in developing evolutionary psychology. So it's really incredible that this has been developed in the last few years. So yeah, thank you so much for that. And yeah, I just wanted to do one sort of fun final question, which was maybe what are the biggest sexual urban myths of our time? I remember reading in the book The Beer Goggles. Maybe you can expand on that and any other possible myth.
Oh yeah. Well, the beer goggles isn't exactly a myth. So, but yeah. So what you're referring to is that do girls get prettier near closing time effect, and the short answer is yes, they do. And so there was an initial study actually published by a current colleague of mine, Jamie Pennebaker. That he went into bars and he had people rate, members of the opposite sex on how attractive they were, as closing time approached, and found that, even though they're the same people, the people got more and more attractive as closing time approached. And some people argue that, no, this is a beer goggles effect. That is, people are just getting drunker and drunker. And so everything looks good when you're drunk. And then you wake up in the morning sober with a hangover and you go, oh, geez, what was I thinking? But it turns out that so the subsequent studies statistically controlled for alcohol consumption, and you do get a beer goggles effect. So alcohol does influence your perceptions, but the closing time effect occurs above and beyond the alcohol consumption. And the way I interpret that is it's an effect primarily, the strongest effect is in men. And the way I interpret it as the window of opportunity for a potential sexual encounter starts to close, people literally perceive more women as attractive to increase their chances of a sexual encounter that evening. So, and what was your question again? What was the fundamental question?
Any other myth?
Oh, urban myths. Yeah, well, urban myths. Well, the myth that men and women are identical in their sexual psychology is probably the biggest one. And I think that individuals hold what you could call myths in the sense that we're kind of stuck in the interior of our own minds, in our own mating psychology, and we have to infer the mating psychology of others, and in particular the opposite sex. And that's a very difficult thing to do, because what people do is they assume that other people are similar to them. And so it results in some forms of sexual conflict, like that a man is attracted to a woman and he thinks, well, it's inconceivable. I'm so attracted to her that she must feel the same way about me. This sexual overperception bias that I talk about a bit in The Evolution of Desire and in more detail in the new book. And so I think that these are myths, if you will, or errors of inference that we all carry around with us, and that a deeper understanding of the sexual psychology of the other sex is critical in getting out of your own head and not making these types of errors.
Wow, right. And that's a big root of sexual conflict, as you say, right? And sexual assault.
Yes.
Well, okay. Well, thank you. Thank you so much, David. This has been very, very enriching conversation, at least for me. And, I think this is true, as you said, that it should be taught in high schools and even beforehand, because it's true that this could really be part of the reasons that this lack of education could be the reason that there is sexual assault in many areas in the world, and
sexual harassment. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So, well, it's been great talking to you, Alvaro, as well, and Davis. I wish you both the best of luck in your. Someday, if we meet over a beer, you'll tell me what your mating stories are. But maybe if when I come to Spain, we can have a beer and chat about that.
Absolutely.
I have some good friends at UT, so if I'm ever there, also I'll definitely contact you for sure.
Yeah,
it was a really interesting conversation.
Cool. Shoot me an email, and love to do that. So, all right, great talking to you guys. So,
great talking.
Adios. Okay, take care.
Have a good time, David.
Thank you.